Somewhere in a ledger drawn up inside a small stone church on the edge of the Minas Basin, in a colony the French called Acadie and the British called Nova Scotia, a soldier with a quill wrote down a name. He wrote the man's parish, whether he was married, how many sons stood beside him, how many daughters waited at home, how many head of cattle and sheep and hogs the family owned. He was not compiling a census for the crown of France. He was compiling an inventory for a deportation. The year was 1755. The church was Saint Charles de Mines at Grand Pré, and the role that soldier and his fellow officers filled out that autumn is one of the last complete records of a people who were about to be scattered across half the Atlantic world. If you carry an Acadian surname, a name like Leblanc, Landry, Thériault, Hébert, Boudreau, Melançon, Doucet, Comeau, Richard, or Godet, there is a real possibility that an ancestor of yours stood in that church, or one like it at Pisiquid, or Chignecto, or Port Royal, and heard his name entered onto a list that would decide, within weeks, where his children would spend the rest of their lives. This is the story of that roll, of the people it named, of the ones it could not account for, and of a bloodline that survived the fire, the ships, and the 250 years of silence that followed. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand what was written on that roll, you have to go back 150 years, to 1604, when a small party of French colonists under Pierre Duguay de Mons and Samuel de Champlain established a settlement at Port Royal on the Bay of Fundy. Most of the people who eventually built the colony of Acadie did not come from Paris or from the fashionable provinces of France. Genealogical research into the founding families, much of it compiled in Stephen A. White's Dictionnaire généalogique des familles acadiennes, traces roughly 2 out of every 3 Acadian founders to a small cluster of parishes in the Loudunais region of Poitou, places with names like Loudun, Martézais, and La Chaussée, with smaller contributions from Aunis, Saintonge, Brittany, Normandy, and the Basque country. The founding population itself was small, somewhere between 800 and 1,000 individuals across a century and a half of settlement, which means that nearly every person who can trace an Acadian line today descends from the same narrow handful of villages and the same few hundred surnames. What they built on the shores of the Bay of Fundy was unlike anything else in French or British North America. They diked the marshland using a system of wooden sluices called aboiteaux, drained the tidal flats, and turned salt marsh into some of the most productive farmland in the northern colonies. They lived apart from the wars that consumed the rest of the continent, and for decades they managed something almost no other colonial population achieved. They stayed neutral. Much of that neutrality was made possible by a relationship the official French and British records mention only in passing: the alliance, and in a great many individual cases, the intermarriage between Acadian settlers and the Mi'kmaq nation, whose territory the colony occupied. Acadian villages had no garrison, no formal colonial governor in residence for long stretches of the 17th century, and largely governed their own local affairs through elected deputies who negotiated directly with whichever crown currently claimed sovereignty. That kind of loose, semi-autonomous community, built on farming, on the aboiteaux dikes, and on decades of cooperation with the Mi'kmaq rather than conflict, was almost unique in the colonial Atlantic world. And it is precisely the kind of community that leaves few written records of the personal relationships holding it together. Marriages, godparent relationships, and land-sharing arrangements between Acadian and Mi'kmaq families were common enough to be unremarkable at the time, which is exactly why so few of them were formally recorded, and exactly why so much of that connection had to wait for DNA rather than paper to resurface. That neutrality became their undoing. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 transferred mainland Nova Scotia from France to Britain, but the Acadians who lived there did not leave, and the British administration that took possession of the territory did not expel them either, not yet. For 4 decades, the Acadians occupied a strange middle position, French by language, culture, and faith, but technically subjects of the British Crown, and they navigated it by refusing to swear an unconditional oath of allegiance that would have obligated them to bear arms against France or against their Mi'kmaq neighbors and trading partners. British officials called them, with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect, the French neutrals. That arrangement held until the geopolitics of empire made it intolerable. By the 1750s, war between Britain and France was building again in North America, French forts stood at Beauséjour on the Chignecto Isthmus, and a growing Acadian population, now numbering somewhere near 14,000 souls, sat directly across the most contested ground in the northern colonies, farming land the British wanted for themselves and refusing, still, to fully commit to either crown. On the 28th of July, 1755, the governor of Nova Scotia, Charles Lawrence, met with his council and made a decision that had likely been under consideration for some time. The Acadians, all of them, would be removed from the province, their lands and livestock confiscated, and the population dispersed among the British colonies so thoroughly that they could never again gather in sufficient numbers to threaten British control or resettle as a distinct people. The immediate trigger for Lawrence's decision had come only weeks earlier, in June of 1755, when British and New England forces captured Fort Beauséjour on the Chignecto Isthmus, the last significant French military position on the Nova Scotia peninsula. Inside the fort, British officers found a small number of Acadian men who had been compelled, under threat from the French missionary and agitator Abbé Jean-Louis Le Loutre, to help defend it. That handful of names was enough. Lawrence and his council treated the discovery as proof that the Acadian population as a whole could not be trusted to remain neutral once French military pressure was applied, and used it to justify a policy that had, in truth, been discussed and drafted in outline for years before a single shot was fired at Beauséjour. The order reached Grand Pré 5 weeks later. On the 5th of September 1755 at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel John Winslow, commanding a regiment of New England provincial troops, had the male inhabitants of the district summoned to the church of Saint-Charles-des-Mines. 250 men and boys crowded into the small building expecting some routine announcement about the harvest or the militia. Instead, Winslow read a proclamation declaring their lands, houses, and livestock forfeit to the crown, and informing them that they and their families were to be removed from the province. He then had the doors barred. The men were held prisoner inside the church and in nearby buildings for over a month, while ships were assembled to carry them and their families away. In Pisiquid, a similar scene played out under Captain Alexander Murray at Fort Edward. At Chignecto and Beaubassin, deportations had already begun weeks earlier. At Port Royal and Annapolis Royal, and later at Ile Saint-Jean, what is now Prince Edward Island, the same pattern repeated itself along the coast through the autumn and into the following years. Outside the barred doors of Saint-Charles-des-Mines, the wives, children, and elderly parents of the imprisoned men spent that month doing what they could to prepare for a departure whose destination they were never told. Livestock that could not be driven onto the ships was slaughtered or left behind for the soldiers guarding the district. Household goods too heavy to carry were buried, hidden in the marsh grass, or simply abandoned in houses that would, within weeks, be burned to the ground. Winslow's own officers noted with some discomfort that the confined men, watching from inside the church, could see the smoke of their own farms in the distance before they were ever put aboard a ship. It is during those weeks of imprisonment at Grand Pré that the role this video is named for was compiled. British officers, working from the muster of men held in the church, recorded each man's name, his parish, whether he was married or single, the number of sons and daughters in his household, and an inventory of his livestock, oxen, cows, young cattle, sheep, and hogs. Copies of these lists survive today, preserved among Winslow's papers and held by institutions including the Massachusetts Historical Society, and they have been reproduced and studied by Acadian genealogical societies for generations. Alongside the 1755 deportation rolls sits an earlier document that genealogists consider just as vital, the Census of Acadia, taken in 1752 under Sieur de la Roque, commissioned by French authorities only 3 years before the expulsion. Together, these two documents form the last full accounting of the Acadian population before it was broken apart, a census that names the family and a deportation roll that names the exile. If your family carries an Acadian surname and you have never checked these records, there is a specific document with a specific name on it, possibly your name, sitting in an archive, waiting. The 1752 census recorded families parish by parish across the peninsula, at Grand Pré, Pisiquid, Cobequid, Chignecto, Port Royal, and along the coast of what is now the Nova Scotia mainland, noting not just names but acreage under cultivation, orchards, and livestock, a portrait of a settled, prosperous agricultural people 3 years before it was dismantled. Modern researchers working through the Programme de Recherche en Démographie Historique, a demographic archive maintained in Quebec, have cross-referenced entries from that census against the Winslow rolls and against the baptismal and marriage registers that survived in fragments across 3 colonial powers, reconstructing family units that the deportation itself had scattered without any single surviving document able to reunite them. The Pisiquid roll, compiled under Captain Murray at Fort Edward, follows the same format as Winslow's, name by name, household by household, and where the two rolls overlap, in cases of extended families with branches recorded in both districts, researchers have been able to confirm relationships that neither list states outright, simply by matching patronyms, ages, and livestock counts across two documents written independently of one another by two different officers in two different garrisons in the same autumn. The names that recur across these lists form a relatively short catalogue, a consequence of that narrow founding population from Poitou and the neighboring provinces. Melançon, Thériault, sometimes recorded as Thériot, Leblanc, Bourgeois, Landry, Hébert, Boudreau, later written Boudreaut in some branches, Comeau, Doucet, Poirier, Richard, Arsenault, Godet, Aucoin, Babin, Bourque, Cormier, Dugas, Forest, Girouard, Gaudin, Guilbeault, Robichaud, Savoie, Vincent, Broussard, and Mius, a name belonging to one of the oldest noble families of the colony, descended from Philippe Mius d'Entremont, who arrived at Port Royal in the 1630s and whose descendants, over generations of contact and intermarriage with the Mi'kmaq nation, carried both French and indigenous ancestry forward without a formal record of how thoroughly the two had blended. If any of these names, or a variant spelling of them, appears in your own family tree, you are looking at a thread that runs directly back to the Minas Basin and to the roll drawn up inside that church. It is worth pausing on how differently this history has been remembered compared to how it was actually recorded. In 1847, the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who had never visited Nova Scotia and had no Acadian ancestry himself, published a long narrative poem called Evangeline, a tale of Acadie, imagining a single fictional bride separated from her betrothed on the day of the deportation and searching for him for the rest of her life. The poem became enormously popular, and it is largely responsible for the fact that Grand Pré is remembered internationally at all. But Evangeline was invented. She appears on no muster, no baptismal register, no ship's manifest. The actual names, the actual sons and daughters and head of cattle, sat largely unread in colonial archives for well over a century, while millions of readers wept over a heroine who never existed. Only in the 20th century did genealogists and historians begin doing the slower, less romantic work of matching the real Winslow rolls and the real 1752 census against surviving parish records, family Bibles, and eventually DNA, to recover the actual people the fictional poem had quietly stood in for. What happened after the reading at Grand Pré was not a single event, but a slow, brutal unraveling that lasted the better part of a decade. In the final months of 1755 alone, roughly 6,000 Acadians, close to half the entire population of the colony, were loaded onto transport ships and carried away. Soldiers burned the houses and barns behind them, partly to punish resistance and partly to ensure that anyone who fled into the woods, rather than boarding the ships, would have nothing to return to. Winslow's own journal records the scene on the 8th of October, 1755, as the embarkation began. He wrote of women in great distress carrying their children in their arms, of the elderly being carried out in carts, of a scene of woe and confusion as families realized, in many cases, that husbands were being separated from wives and children from parents, placed deliberately on different ships bound for different colonies so that reunification would be difficult or impossible. The first transports sailed for Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and South Carolina. Later waves went to Georgia, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. In November of that same year, a powerful earthquake struck the Atlantic seaboard, felt from Halifax to the Chesapeake, and combined with a string of severe autumn storms, it drove at least one deportation ship off course, and contributed to losses at sea that were never fully accounted for. Families that had already been divided by British policy were divided again by weather and by chance, and some branches simply vanish from the record at this point, their fate reconstructible only through the destination lists of the colonies that eventually reported receiving them, or not reconstructible at all. The deportations did not stop in 1755. They continued in further waves through 1762, sweeping up Ile Saint-Jean and the remaining Acadian settlements along the St. John River, and by the time the Grand Dérangement finally wound down, historians estimate that somewhere between 10 and 12,000 Acadians, out of a total population that had never much exceeded 14,000, had been forcibly removed, making it, by proportion of population affected, one of the most complete forced removals of a civilian population in 18th century North America. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The deportation did not end the erasure. In several of the colonies where Acadian families were unloaded, the reception was openly hostile. Virginia's House of Burgesses refused to accept the roughly 1,000 Acadians sent to its shores, on the grounds that as Catholics they posed a political and religious danger, and had them shipped onward across the Atlantic to England instead. There, with no colony obligated to receive them, most were held for years in port towns including Liverpool, Bristol, Southampton, and Falmouth, often confined aboard the transport ships themselves or in makeshift quarters on shore, and disease took a severe toll on a population already weakened by the crossing. Maryland, a colony with a Catholic founding history, proved somewhat more welcoming, and roughly 900 Acadians settled there for a period of years, many still hoping the war would end and they would be permitted to return north. Georgia and the Carolinas saw Acadian arrivals scatter and, in many documented cases, attempt overland journeys back toward Canada rather than remain, journeys that in several instances ended in death from exposure or in capture and redetention. Pennsylvania received Acadians into Philadelphia, where colonial authorities, uneasy about a sudden influx of destitute French Catholics, in some cases indentured Acadian children to English-speaking Protestant households, a practice that historians researching the period have documented as an active mechanism of cultural and religious assimilation, deliberately separating children from the language, faith, and surname pronunciation of their parents. This is where the erasure stops being a matter of policy and becomes a matter of surnames, and it is worth sitting with the specifics, because this is the part of the record that a family history rarely preserves intact. Acadian families who remained for any length of time in Anglo-Protestant colonies faced enormous, sustained pressure to conform. Within a generation, in many documented family lines, the French language was no longer spoken in the home. Within 2 generations, in some lines, Catholic baptismal and marriage records give way entirely to entries in English-language Protestant parish registers. Surnames bent under the same pressure. Boudreau appears in some English colonial records as Boudreau or Bushrow. LeBlanc, whose name simply means white, was in a documented number of cases translated outright into the English surname White. Doucet becomes Doucet. Thériault becomes Thériault or Thériault, spellings that later became standard among the family's Louisiana branches rather than markers of assimilation there, but that began in the northern colonies as an accommodation to English-speaking clerks who had never encountered the name before. A family that entered the historical record in 1755 as unmistakably Acadian could, by the time of the American Revolution 20 years later, be recorded in a county register as an ordinary English-speaking Protestant household with no annotation anywhere connecting it back to the church at Grand Pré. The erasure, in these cases, was not a single dramatic act. It was a slow accumulation of small clerical choices, intermarriages, and survival strategies, each one small enough to seem unremarkable, until the sum of them had removed a family's Acadian identity from its own written record entirely. While the deported families were being scattered and slowly stripped of their names in colonies to the south, the land they had built was being handed to someone else. Within a few years of the expulsion, Nova Scotia's government began actively recruiting New England planters, English-speaking Protestant farmers from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, to occupy the confiscated dikelands around Grand Pré and Minas. Offering the cleared, drained, already productive farmland the Acadians had spent a century and a half building as an incentive for resettlement. Governor Lawrence's own correspondence to his superiors in London, written within weeks of the deportation, said plainly that once the French were gone, the empty and immediately cultivable land would help draw new colonists more quickly than raw wilderness ever could. The dikes did not need to be rebuilt. The planters simply moved in behind them. Not every branch of the Exile chose, or was permitted, that kind of disappearance. Hundreds of Acadians evaded the 1755 roundups altogether, fleeing into the forests of what is now New Brunswick, toward the Miramichi and Restigouche river systems, or north into French-held territory around Quebec, enduring years of hardship and, in a number of documented cases, starvation rather than board the ships. When British restrictions on Acadian resettlement in the Maritimes finally eased after 1764, it was these families and others who slowly made their way back from the Anglo-American colonies and from imprisonment in England who reconstituted Acadian communities on new ground in what is now New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Cape Breton, deliberately choosing land away from the fertile Minas Basin farms the British had already redistributed to New England settlers. A separate and larger movement, beginning in 1765 and continuing through the founding migration of 1785, when 7 ships carrying roughly 1,600 Acadian exiles sailed directly from France to Spanish Louisiana, produced the population that would become known, through a slow corruption of the word Acadian in English and Spanish mouths, as Cajun. The first of those 7 ships, a frigate named Bon Papa, under Captain Pelletier, left the port of Nantes on the 10th of May, 1785, carrying 34 families, 156 people in total, and reached New Orleans 81 days later, on the 29th of July. The voyage records for Bon Papa survive in detail, down to a single death at sea and the births and desertions recorded after landfall, and they stand as one of the clearest surviving documents of the entire diaspora, a direct, traceable line from a French port to a Louisiana parish for the families aboard her. It is worth stating plainly that the word Cajun is not a separate ethnic origin from Acadian. It is the same bloodline, the same handful of Poitou parishes, the same names from the Grand Pré roll, filtered through a different climate, a different colonial government, and, eventually, a different and equally deliberate campaign of suppression. That second suppression is closer to living memory than most viewers expect. Louisiana's state constitution of 1921 mandated English as the sole language of public school instruction, and in the decades that followed, generations of Cajun children were punished, in documented and widely recounted instances, for speaking French on school grounds, made to stand in corners, write lines, or in some accounts, endure worse for using the only language spoken at their family table. Parents began deliberately withholding French from their own children, not out of indifference to their heritage, but as a direct protective response to the punishment that heritage invited. Within a single generation in many Cajun families, fluent French speakers raised children who understood the language passively, if at all, and grandchildren who understood almost nothing beyond a handful of inherited phrases and the family surname itself. It was not until 1968, when the Louisiana legislature created the Council for the Development of French in Louisiana under Jimmy Domengeau, that the state formally reversed course and began actively working to preserve what 2 centuries of expulsion, assimilation, and institutional punishment had nearly extinguished. Set against 250 years of separation, translation, indenture, and enforced silence, it is the DNA, more than any surviving paper record, that has begun putting the scattered branches of this bloodline back into conversation with one another. Because the founding Acadian population was so small and so geographically concentrated in its origin, it left a distinct genetic signature, one that population geneticists and medical researchers have been documenting since the late 1990s. Certain inherited conditions occur in the Acadian population, and in populations descended from it in Louisiana and Maine, at frequencies far higher than in the general population, a hallmark of what geneticists call a founder effect, the genetic fingerprint left behind when a large modern population descends from a very small number of original ancestors. Usher syndrome type 1C, a condition causing profound deafness alongside progressive vision loss, is strongly associated with Acadian ancestry, traced by researchers to a specific founder mutation carried by early colonists from the Laudonnais region. A related Usher syndrome variant, type 2A, appears in both Quebec and Acadian descendant populations, confirming, at the molecular level, what the genealogical record already suggested, that the Acadian and Quebec founding streams, though they settled different territories, drew from overlapping French origins. Genetic counselors working in Louisiana and the Canadian Maritimes today routinely ask patients of French Acadian or Cajun descent about family history precisely because of this founder pattern, decades before any of those patients may have thought to research their own genealogy. None of this means a family carrying these markers is defined by illness. It means that a specific, traceable, 300-year-old thread runs directly from a handful of parishes in 17th century Poitou, through Grand Pré, through the deportation ships, and into the DNA test results ordinary people are opening on their kitchen tables today. Commercial autosomal tests, the kind sold by the major consumer genealogy companies, are generally not precise enough on their own to separate an Acadian ancestor from a broader French or French-Canadian category, because the underlying reference populations used to build those ethnicity estimates were not designed around a founding group this small and this specific. That is exactly why the dedicated Acadian and Quebec genetic genealogy projects, working with raw data uploaded from those same commercial tests, have become so essential. They take the same raw autosomal file a person downloads from a mainstream testing company and run it against a purpose-built database of confirmed Acadian descendants, catching a signal the general-purpose ethnicity estimate was never built to isolate. The DNA has revealed something else, something the paper record almost entirely failed to preserve, which is the extent of Acadian intermarriage with the Mi'kmaq Nation, the indigenous people who occupied the maritime region long before Dougois, Des Moines, and Champlain arrived, and who lived alongside the Acadian settlers, largely in cooperation, for the full century and a half of the colony's existence. Genealogists working through mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child, largely unchanged across generations, have identified Native American maternal haplogroups running through the direct female lines of families that, on paper, present as entirely French. Projects such as the Acadian Amerindian Ancestry Group, working with descendants across Louisiana, the Maritime Provinces, Quebec, and New England, have traced specific maternal lines, women whose names barely survive in the record, if they survive at all, back to early Mi'kmaq mothers whose descendants took entirely French surnames through marriage and left no documentary trace of their origin beyond what their children's children's children would eventually find encoded in their own cells. A person carrying the surname Mius or Comau or any of a dozen others and testing positive for a Native American mitochondrial haplogroup is not looking at a contradiction. They are looking at exactly the kind of hidden lineage this roll was never designed to record, a bloodline the 18th century simply had no category for, and the 20th and 21st century's genetic tools were the first instruments precise enough to recover. The work of identifying these lines has largely been done outside of academic institutions, by descendants themselves. A volunteer genetic genealogy project, established in 2006 and later renamed the Acadian Amerindian Ancestry Project, has spent close to 2 decades matching Y-DNA and mitochondrial results from thousands of participants against documented Acadian surnames, and a related effort, informally known among researchers as the Founding Mothers of Acadia Project, has worked specifically to identify the earliest maternal ancestors of Acadian families through their mitochondrial signatures, in some cases connecting a woman like Françoise Godet, born in the 1620s in Martezay, and carrying the maternal haplogroup J1b2, to thousands of living descendants who had no idea their line traced to that particular village, that particular mother, that specifically. In Maryland, where the roughly 900 Acadian exiles once waited out the war, a historical marker was placed in recent years, after a 2-year campaign by a genealogist and Acadian descendant, to commemorate a settlement history that had otherwise gone unmarked in the American landscape for 2.5 centuries. It is a small monument, a few sentences of engraved text on a roadside, and it exists at all only because someone traced a paper trail, and a genetic one, back to a group of refugees the state itself had stopped keeping track of by 1763. What survives, then, is layered. It survives in the Winslow rolls themselves, digitized now and searchable by surname through Acadian genealogical archives and the Massachusetts Historical Society's own collections. It survives in the 1752 census, taken just before the storm broke, the last complete portrait of a people about to be dispersed. It survives in parish registers scattered from Poitou to Louisiana to the Maritime Provinces, painstakingly cross-referenced over decades by researchers like Stephen White into a genealogical dictionary that remains the definitive reference for the entire Acadian founding population. It survives in a founder mutation on a single gene, inherited without interruption for 3 centuries. And it survives, most quietly of all, in the maternal lines that no 18th century clerk thought to record, women whose Mi'kmaq ancestry was folded into French households and French surnames so completely that only a chromosome, tested 250 years later, could bring it back into view. The church at Grand Pré still stands today, rebuilt as a memorial on the original site, first recognized as a National Historic Site in 1961, and inscribed by UNESCO as a World Heritage Cultural Landscape in 2012. The dykelands the Acadians built, still holding back the tide exactly as they were designed to, 300 years on. The names read out inside that church in September of 1755 are still legible in the archival copies of that roll. Somewhere on that list, or on one very much like it from Pisiquid or Chignecto or Port Royal, a name may be waiting that you have carried your entire life without knowing exactly where it came from, or everything it survived to reach you. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.